Okay, the order of business goes like this. In a moment, I will introduce Professor William Davies. He will then give prepared comments lasting 30 to 45 minutes about his book, Nervous States, Democracy and the Decline of Reason. Then there will be a curated Q&A session in which I'll be posing questions and comments to Professor Davies among those that were sent to us in a Google form by the False Start College scholars. And that'll last also another 30 to 45 minutes. And then finally, there'll be a general Q&A for everyone involved, again, lasting about 30 to 45 minutes, and that will round the meeting out. So, William Davies is a professor in political economy at Goldsmiths College, University of London, where he's also co-director of the Political Economy Research Center. His work focuses on the history of ideas and how expert knowledge shapes politics and society today. Some of his particular interests are in neoliberalism, the science of happiness, distrust in experts, and the present crisis of liberalism. He has written for a number of venues where interesting ideas are shared, including The Guardian, The New Statesman, the London Review of Books, the New Left Review, Open Democracy, the New York Times, and The Atlantic. And so I'd like to pass the baton over to Professor Davies to begin his presentation.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for this very kind invitation to come and speak to you all today about my book. It's a great honor to be invited for this, and I'm delighted that my book is being read around the world and is provoking discussions. I'm going to share my slides now. I hope that everybody can see this opening slide, but I'm sure someone will let me know if not. So I'm going to talk to you about my book, Nervous States. I understand that many of you have got a copy of the book, which I'm delighted to hear, and some of you no doubt have read further into it than others. So what I'm going to try and do today is to provide an overview of the argument in the book, which is quite an expansive argument, as some of you may already have noticed, and it covers a lot of historical and philosophical and political ground. So it's in some ways quite a difficult book to encapsulate in a talk, but let me just start by pointing out something which some of you may already have figured, which is that the title Nervous States is a pun, in the sense that it's about political states that are in a state of some unease, that, as some of the comments already today have pointed towards, but it's also about nervous states in the embodied emotional sense of being in a condition in which one is over attentive to the present and to an emerging future, and is in a state of heightened reactivity and heightened alertness. Because part of the central thesis of the book is that it is the way in which a sense of nervousness, but also in a broader technologies of that inject a kind of nervousness into society, have generated some of the technological and social conditions for some of the political upheavals that we've seen in recent years. I just need to make sure that this is okay. Now, the book began with an incident that was a very important one in the history of my own country, the United Kingdom, which was that as you've no doubt heard, there was our own political rupture occurred in the June of 2016. This is an image that was taken around about 3 in the morning on the 24th of June 2016. And this was one of those political events in that year that many of us stayed up all night watching, not really fully understanding exactly what was going on. But one of the interesting things about this political disruption, which has generated all sorts of subsequent political upheavals, which are still ongoing, quite aside from the pandemic, is that this political event and this perceived crisis of liberal democracy in the United Kingdom was also a crisis of the status of knowledge in society. That is, it was a crisis of, it was an epistemological crisis as well as a political one. That is, it was a crisis in the status that we grant experts and knowledge in our public sphere and in our politics. And this registered in various ways. First of all, the polls were quite significantly wrong. People were taken by complete surprise by the result of this outcome, which was the vote to leave the European Union. Secondly, there were all sorts of experts, and particularly economists, had been mobilized and used by the Remain campaign in order, the campaign to remain in the European Union, in order to try and advise people against voting to leave. And this had been a complete failure. Economists had been wheeled out in order to say, you must vote to remain in this trading bloc, and people had defied that. The government itself had commissioned various reports published by the Treasury Department and the Bank of England, saying that if you vote to leave the European Union, there will be some kind of immediate economic crisis in the form of a recession and unemployment and falling house prices. Still, people were not sufficiently moved by that evidence to do anything about it. There was also the status of what frankly were lies in the campaign used by the Leave side of the debate about the amount of money that Britain was sending to the European Union. There was a famous campaign slogan about the cost of European Union membership that was statistically false, and yet it didn't really matter at the end of the day. One of the most prominent Leave campaigners, Michael Gove, who is now a senior figure in Boris Johnson's government, famously said in an interview leading up to the vote that I think people in this country have had enough of experts. And this was seen as an expression of something really quite dramatic that took lots of people by surprise. And then, as you will probably be not surprised to hear, given what happened a few months later in the United States, it was later discovered that there had been an extremely extensive Facebook campaign being used by the Leave side. I mean, both sides were using Facebook, but that in the final hours before the vote, a whole new raft of adverts were put out containing extreme anti-European propaganda about the way animals are treated in different countries around the European Union, false claims about various countries that were likely to join the European Union, leading to the movement of Muslims into Britain and so on, trying to trigger particular types of reaction and fear, cultural anxieties. So this all came out subsequently. I'm not going to talk much longer about Brexit, which is a rather parochial concern, but the map that was emerged from the result of this referendum in 2016 was one that mirrored in some ways the political splits that the United States has experienced for far longer, in the sense that those who voted for the Remain side, rather like those who vote for the Democrat Party, tended to be clustered in large metropolitan cities around these kind of wealth-producing areas of the southeast, and the big yellow blob you can see in the middle there is linking cities of Oxford, Bristol and London, where there's a lot of international investment and foreign direct investment goes on around there. And also university towns. Those other smaller blobs, many of those, the yellow blobs, many of those are also university towns. So this division between centers of so-called liberal elite influence and wealth production and knowledge production versus these more peripheral rural areas, in particular the coastal towns, but also some of the ex-industrial areas of South Wales, the northeast, and in particular former coal fields and these sorts of areas that voted to leave the European Union, much to the surprise of many people. And this was a split that has become a familiar feature, particularly since 2016 in American politics, but we hadn't ever quite encountered this sort of cultural divide. And that was also manifest in a split between younger voters and older voters, between graduates and non-graduates. And this kind of division that has now since spiraled into a type of culture war of a sort that I think Britain has not been familiar with until recently was something that took people by some shock. there was also something which in some ways kind of opened up questions about what had happened to the basic status of economic rationality in politics. This is a graph from the Financial Times showing that the places that actually got the largest redistribution from the European Union were voting most heavily to leave the European Union. So this posed questions about, was politics taking on the quality of a type of self-harm, in a sense, a sort of self-sabotaging dimension to this political movement. Now, I'm not the expert enough compared to many of you here to talk about what happened then only less than 4 months later, but there were similar developments that emerged in the surprising victory, or surprising to many people, victory of Donald Trump in November of the same year, which similarly, as some of the statistics I have in my book, showed that measured by county, the vast majority of the bulk of US GDP was being produced in counties that had voted for Hillary Clinton, that there is a split that was crucially sort of epistemological in the sense that I'm going to be talking about, in terms of trust in what might be broadly called the public record of American political life. 86% of Clinton voters broadly trusted the economic data being produced by the federal government, compared to just 13% of Trump voters. Trump voters, as I'm sure most of you will be unsurprised to hear these sorts of things, were more than twice as likely to distrust what is broadly called the mainstream media as Clinton voters. And of course, these sorts of trends have spiraled in a quite frightening extent in the years since, with new and bigger conspiracy theories taking off. But of course, there was also some of those kinds of educational divisions in certain areas of the country that Britain had seen in that Brexit vote, which Trump took to new levels beyond what had been witnessed before, with his famous phrases such as that he loves the poorly educated, and this sort of attempt to try and create kind of cultural divisions and to take aim at certain aspects of universities and of graduate, the culture of a graduate mentality. And then, of course, as has been debated endlessly, all sorts of evidence came to light later about the use of Facebook and the ways in which different types of fake news and voter suppression techniques were used in that election that have been analysed at great length. Now, all sorts of different phrases emerged, particularly after 2016, that you've probably come across in various ways. There is a whole literature around populism that political scientists have explored, and I'm quite influenced by that and find it very interesting. There is the concept of post-truth that was used a lot. There were 3 books called Post-Truth published in the summer of 2017 in the United Kingdom to try and understand what was going on. Fake news is a concept that is on everybody's lips, or was on everybody's lips after 2016. And then, I mean, people have talked about, is this the death of reason in a more fundamental sense, or some kind of twilight of the elites that some people have commented on. But one of the things which interests me, I should explain that my core discipline, although my work is very interdisciplinary, is sociology. And one of the things which interests me is to try and avoid focusing on some immediate manifestation or symptom of a crisis, because of course there are liars involved in politics now, and of course there's been some quite shameless manipulation of facts and figures and so on. But one of the things which interests me in an effort to try and go beyond some of these kinds of headline claims is to try and understand what are some of the underlying conditions, what are the structural enablers of a type of politics that seems to no longer be bound by matters of fact to the same extent that might have been the case in the past. At least that's how it appears to us. What has come along that has enabled some of these sorts of developments, rather than focusing on the developments themselves, to try and get a sense of some of the underlying historical and structural and epistemological conditions of this. And one of the problems I have in particular with a concept such as post-truth is that it sort of implies that there was an era in which, well, people used to tell the truth and politicians were generally honest, and now we've kind of abandoned that in favor of lies or something, or that we've sort of, moved beyond an era of honesty. And I think that takes us only so far. So one of the things which in my book, which came out in the United States in February 2019, it has a slightly different subtitle actually in Britain, which is Nervous States, How Feeling Took Over the World. And the two halves of the book, one is about the decline of reason, as the US title indicates, and the other half of the book is about the rise of this new type of feeling that I'm going to go on to talk about. And what I wanted to do as I emerged from that night of the 24th of June 2016 and started trying to make sense of what had happened, and then witnessed some similar events happening in the United States that autumn, was to try and understand precisely what it was that seemed to be under threat right now. And rather than just saying that it's truth or that it's reason in the most expansive sense, try and understand exactly what seemed to be being threatened, but also what was taking its place. Because one of the things that I think is worth doing in trying to make sense of the world as we face it, increasingly, especially a chaotic world, is not simply to give way to the idea that order has been replaced just by sheer chaos, or that reason has been replaced by sheer unreason, but that actually there are different technologies, different ideas of knowledge, and different ideas of authority that are on the rise at the moment, as some of the more familiar liberal ones go into decline. I should also warn you that the book, as some of its critics have bemoaned, but I think this is a perfectly important. This is an important thing that some books need to do. The book is primarily diagnosis. It's not a book of prescriptions. It's not a book that says here's our sort of 10-point roadmap out of this situation. But maybe we can talk about what such a roadmap might be in the Q&A. But what I want to do to start with is to try and get you to consider a question which for some scientists and for some scholars and academics, and I'm an academic myself, might seem rather troublesome, which is that there is more than one type of knowledge that is useful to us in society. And I want to start with a rather unusual example that might not seem to have very much to do with politics or Trump or Brexit or any of these sorts of things, which is that here are two different ways of two different tools that are available to me in navigating the part of Southeast London in which I work, of Goldsmiths. And both of these will be familiar to you. One of them is from a famous map, a British map called the A to Z, and the other is from Google Maps. And they're of the same part of London. Let's just think briefly about these two different types of knowledge, and you'll hopefully see why I think this is important. The one on the left, the A to Z image, is a representation of London. It is a model of London. It's actually, for those of you who are older than about 30 or so will remember that this is, you sort of had to kind of, or maybe younger than that, we used to all have to carry these things around in our bags the entire time when we were out and about. You have it in a filofax, or you had a little atlas in your bag. This was how people used to navigate. It is an attempt to create a kind of objective image of how London is organized, and it does so through a type of critical distance from the empirical data that is at hand. It's also the same regardless of where you're trying to go, and it's the same regardless of who you are. It's something you could share with somebody else. It is a type of knowledge that has a kind of public status that is born out of the fact that it is a view of London from some kind of position that is considered to be neutral or independent. The second image is one which is forged out of real-time feedback. It is an image of a situation that you are in right now. I took it when I was in my office. I asked, I want to go home, how do I do it? It's made possible by the development of satellite technologies that were initially produced for purposes of military purposes of the Cold War. It doesn't offer me an objective view of London or of space as such. What it does is it provides an extremely useful sensitivity to my movements, to my objectives, and to the world as it's changing around me. And there's a crucial feature of the image that you see there, which is 24 minutes. That's how long it's suggesting it would take me to drive back home from my office. Now, obviously, this is, as a navigational aid, this is superior in all sorts of ways to the traditional old analog A to Z that you see on the left. But it also produces a very different way of encountering the world. Both of these are knowledge technologies, but they produce a very different way of grasping what it means to be an individual inhabiting and navigating the City of London. The first of these, the one on the left, is a very good way of sharing information with other people. It's a very good educational tool. If you were to teach geography and you wanted people to understand how London is organized and how things fit together, it provides you with this reliable, objective picture of the world that will hold its form regardless of who the person is that you might be teaching about it, what you might be wanting to do in London, where you might be wanting to go. It offers a picture that is the same for everybody. Everybody shares this single picture of the world. The second is very good for responding to one's circumstances, for responding to where one is and where one wants to go to. And it takes for granted that speed of execution is absolutely key to what you are trying to do. It will change the route, as anyone who uses one of these sat-nav type mapping devices, the route constantly changes in response to how much traffic there is in different places. It's not a good way to learn about the geography of London. It's a very good way to exert control over one's situation. It's a very good way to seek to bring the world under, to create at least an illusion that one is in control of where one is and what one is doing. And the reason for this rather sort of odd abstract example at this stage is that it is a core contention of the book that sociologically and politically, over a long period of time, societies such as ours have shifted from a reliance on technologies such as that A to Z on the left towards technologies such as this Google Street Map on the right. And this has involved a shift from a type of knowledge which is objective, but rather slow to adapt, towards types of knowledge which maximize reactivity, maximize speed of updates, but also lack the kinds of objectivity that scholarship and the project of modern science over time has been concerned with. So, and that's just to kind of give you a flavor of how to think epistemologically in the way that I'm trying to do. Now, there's a rather to say that we're witnessing the decline of reason is quite an expansive suggestion, but I think we want to try and hone in on what exactly is the type of knowledge. If we think a bit about that A to Z map example, what can we say about that type of knowledge? Where does it come from? Who does it depend upon, and what makes it possible in the first place? Because it's not enough, and I don't think it's helpful to simply say that certain things are objectively true. We also can think in a more sociological and technical way about things. Now, my book focuses on a particular phase of the development of modern science, really before what we consider to be the Enlightenment, which is that of the late 17th century. There's been a lot written by people like Stephen Shapin and Mary Poovey about what Poovey calls the rise of the modern fact. And my book explores a little bit about some of the developments of the late 17th century, because this is the phase which gives birth to a whole infrastructure and a culture of expert knowledge that I think is taken aim at by some of the political developments that have disrupted democracies in recent years. And this is a particular type of expertise. At the time, it was heavily associated with mercantile capitalism, with the development of early financial communities, early insurance brokerages, and this sort of thing. The centers of these forms of expert knowledge were those which were often tended to be around the centers of mercantile trade, such as cities in Holland and London and these sorts of places. But you see various manifestations of this. I talk in the book about the birth of modern statistics in its recognizable form in the work of people like William Petty and John Graunt. But there was also early newspapers which developed, again, to serve the mercantile community who had a kind of a financial orientation towards the world, needing information about things like shipping times and information about the cost of shipping and the risk updates and so on. It also was the time in which what we now recognize as modern public administration or government bureaucracy really expanded rapidly in the case of the English state between the English Civil War and the late 17th century. Was also when you got things like the birth of the Bank of England, which was the whole ethos and the whole institutional conditions of a political orientation that was dedicated to the processing of facts, that is, of paperwork, of the making and keeping and sustaining and checking of records in various ways. And what all of these different developments share is a respect for standards for the recording of information. Puvi actually goes back much further to talk about the birth of double entry bookkeeping, which occurred really sort of more than over 100 years earlier than this, as being the birth of a type of mentality which is attentive to the recording and the sharing and the standardization of fact keeping. Records would become kept in the public domain, although that was a very narrow public domain compared to anything that we recognize now. It was a public domain that consisted of other merchants, of other early experts, of gentlemen, and was not a very inclusive or broad one. But nevertheless, the idea was that the status of a public record was depended on it, or sorry, the truth value of public records depended on them being committed to the public in some way and being shareable so that they could be checked. A certain new type of individual is born in this time as well, which we would now call an expert. A certain type of what you might call that they had to have a certain kind of ethical orientation, because they couldn't be in search of glory, they couldn't be in search of a particular fame or necessarily in search of wealth on any large scale. They were in some ways what the American science policy expert John Pielke Jr. would call today the honest broker model of a science advisor. But they, in the sense of being someone who could distance themselves from what they were actually talking about and could present facts in a way that was unencumbered with their own personal judgment, with their own moral values, with their own political or religious persuasions. So this was the production of a type of truth that was actually very prosaic. It was stripped of any metaphysical content, of any religious content, a type of truth that could be handed around on paper between other members of a particular type of expert community, but which the validity of those truths did not depend on claims about God or claims about the particular, necessarily the moral character of the person sharing them. The validity of those truths depended on the methods and the standards through which they had been committed to paper. And this is something we kind of take for granted right now, but it's actually one of the things which I try to get across in the book, is that it's actually of huge political and philosophical importance at a time in Europe when arguments about the nature of reality, arguments about the nature of truth, had ripped European societies apart in the form of the 30 Years' War, and also in England in the Civil War. That the question of how to establish trust between people who might believe different things, who might hate each other, who might have different identities, different loyalties and so on, how to enable trust between people under those conditions was the fundamental political, moral and philosophical problem, as most famously explored in the work of the great political philosopher Thomas Hobbes. But although Hobbes was not a fan of these emergent expert communities and this turn towards kind of standardized fact keeping for various reasons, in some ways, this production of a new type of knowledge solved some of the problems that Hobbes was concerned with, in the sense that it was a knowledge that could become a precondition of peace between strangers in various ways. So one of the achievements, if we think about knowledge from a pragmatist perspective, that is in terms of what it does for us, how it helps us, what kinds of political problems it solves, rather than just as being true in and of itself, we can think of the achievement of the late 17th century as the creation of new types of scientific knowledge production that was also the basis for peace, knowledge for peace. And here you see just a couple of examples of the sorts of things that were artifacts of this time. You see the bills of mortality that were produced by John Graunt, one of the pioneers of statistics, which was an attempt to try and record deaths in ways that was could render death predictable. All of the kinds of statistical headlines that you see today in relation to COVID-19, these sorts of rather grim charts of different levels of mortality and infection and so on, the pioneer to which we owe the origin of those sorts of techniques goes back to the work of John Grant and others in the 1670s and 1680s with these sorts of charts. Early anatomical diagrams which turned anatomy into something which treated the human body as just any other type aspect of nature, something that was a bit like a kind of instrument that could be modeled, predicted, intervened in, improved, and so on, as the basis for a modern medicine. So this was actually, of course, now we take this sort of thing for granted, but when people were doing this at the time, this was actually an extremely radical thing to do, to strip the creation of the publishing of scientific claims, strip it of philosophical substance, strip it of religious dimensions, and to try and represent some of the most existential aspects of humankind, i.e. the ways in which they die, the threats to their lives, the nature of their bodies and so on, and to represent them in the prosaic ways in which an accountant might do or a merchant might do. Now, the great strength of this type of knowledge is that it produces trust between strangers, potentially. The weakness that we can now recognize that was really lurking there all along is that it's quite slow to produce. The production of scientific papers, as many of you will know, can take several years in order to get a simple fact validated and verified. Equally, we see fact checkers trying to keep up with Donald Trump, but he's given them so much new claims to investigate by the time that they publish them that everything's kind of moved on. So that the orientation towards the fact is always slightly behind the times. This is one of its features. And then finally, there's a kind of vulnerability here, which was there really right from its origins, but we see played out in our politics today, which is that it relies on those so-called, what we might call the honest brokers, to use John Pielke Jr.'s phrase, that they have to be trusted to be dedicated to public service, and that they can't become seen as having any kind of political agenda of their own. And if they come to be seen as having a political or a cultural agenda of their own, this starts to immediately undermine the status of these kinds of claims. Now, we're going to skip forward, if you don't mind, by 3 centuries or so, and let's think just a bit about the problem of trust as we witness it today, because there's all sorts of debate about the problems of trust. What I've tried to do is to lay out a type of overlapping agenda that united early journalism, early statistics, the early government bureaucrats, and the experts of expert communities, and these all were engaged in similar types of problems. Now, one of the interesting things, I think, as we talk about post-truth and the crisis of expertise today, is that actually, as many people have reminded me in relation to my book, actually there's not that much evidence that trust in science has fallen. These surveys from the United States, but trust in science and scientists has not fallen dramatically in recent years. And in particular, trust in medics and doctors has remained always very high. Where there has been quite a significant crisis of trust dating back to really in the United Kingdom anyway, it begins really in the early 1980s, is in the mainstream media. And so it's the ability to actually bring facts into the public domain, those who are the gatekeepers of the public sphere, and through which other types of fact and expert claim have to travel, that have become seen as unreliable. And this means that the viability of that project in which these sorts of honest brokers produce facts, they produce statistics and so on, that as soon as they start to travel around politically, you see quite a major crisis that has engulfed societies such as the United States and many societies around the world. In Britain, there's evidence that people have very high trust in the Office for National Statistics, which is an independent body, although it's publicly funded, but they have very low trust in politicians, the way politicians use statistics. So what we can see is that where trust becomes a major problem in today's world is specifically in relation to individuals who have got some kind of vocation towards being towards the public sphere, that they have got a vocation to either share news, publish news in the form of journalism, or to be in the limelight of news, as in the case of elected officials and politicians. And this is just this is now, I think this is from 2017, this is from Pew, but this shows a familiar story, and this is not that different from what you see in many Northern European countries as well. And you can see that there are all sorts of so-called elites and experts that continue to hold relatively high trust, such as medical scientists and scientists. But what you can see is that the trust in politicians and in the media is so low that there has been a kind of collapse in a sense of a shared political world that has engulfed all sorts of sections of our societies. And one of the things which a lot of the sociology of this sort of thing shows is that when people lose trust in one pillar of public information and the public sphere, they tend to lose trust in all sorts of them all simultaneously. That you get this kind of collapse in both trust in government, trust in the politicians that are elected to run the government, and trust in the media. But also this potentially engulfs forms of expertise as well. There is, I think the other thing which I think is important is that statistics have themselves over time have been used in order to try and capture images of nations, of societies as a whole. One of the things which interested me as I was writing the book was all of the various sociological and economic forces which have undermined the validity of some of the headline indicators that we've become kind of so focused on via our media and via our politicians, things like gross domestic product, things like unemployment. But when you scratch beneath the surface of some of these sorts of headline indicators that have become so powerful in the corridors of government, and then you think about, well, what happens when half of a society, as is the case in the United States, has no increase in their real wages for 40 years, as the work of Thomas Piketty has demonstrated? What does that mean about the fact that GDP has maybe doubled or tripled in that time if half of the population have had no increase in their real wages? Why do we remain focused on one of those headline indicators when it actually doesn't capture the experiences of 50% of society? Equally, one of the things that I looked at was the way in which the labour markets, unemployment figures are very low in many societies around the world, including the United Kingdom, but until recently, it's all a bit unclear at the moment. But you have this chronic problem of non-employment, that's people who have dropped out of the labour market, underemployment, and these sorts of problems. There's a whole question mark over in the United States as to why the labour market has actually been, in particular areas of the labour market have been shrinking as people withdraw due to reasons of ill health, addiction, and simply giving up looking for work, which means they no longer focus on the search, they no longer count in unemployment statistics. There are other things which I think are worth reflecting on as well, which I talk a bit about in my book as well, which I think have been highlighted to a great extent by behavioral economists and by psychologists, which show that actually people are often affected and motivated more by changes in their conditions, often very short-term changes in their conditions, rather than by objective levels. And also that loss affects people psychologically more than gains. And the reason I think this is significant is that when I go back to that, some of those, what happened with, say, Brexit, why were people who actually were upwardly mobile or were getting, whose prosperity was quite high or were getting generous handouts from the European Union, how could we explain the fact that people still seem to vote against their own interests? And there's quite a lot of psychological literature on how populist voters tend to exhibit much higher levels of what they call relative deprivation. That is, people who might be quite well off but see others doing better than them, or else others below them catching up with them. And that relative questions of status, which is an intrinsically relative phenomenon, exert a stronger psychological force over us than the sorts of rather utilitarian approach that economics has used, and also the focus on aggregates that statisticians use. Equally, that often it's the extremely recent experiences of deprivation and job loss that push people towards types of nationalism and populist support. There's work done in the United States, in Southern Europe, showing how sympathies for nationalist parties do not correlate to aggregate unemployment levels. They correlate to areas where there is a recent loss of a recent surge of unemployment, so that it's changes in levels rather than aggregates that arguably that 17th century statistical project has not been so well attuned to. Now, I'm going to I have a few more slides. I'm just conscious of the time, but the second half of my book is an attempt to try and the second half of my talk today is an attempt to try and understand how can people's sense of being in the world, their orientation towards the world, and also their knowledge of the world, their way of understanding what's going on in the world, what fills the void when some of these sorts of forms of objective representations cease to function in various ways for various reasons. And one of the things which I think is interesting when we think about the idea of feelings is that the term feeling, when we relate it to emotions, maybe you say, oh, you know, there's that phrase that is it, I can't remember, is it Ben Shapiro or someone says feelings don't care, facts don't care about your feelings, as if feelings are kind of have no scientific value whatsoever, that facts are where truth lies and that feelings have no relationship to truth or reality. Well, that's not actually the case, actually. I think we all human beings know that their feelings tell them quite important things quite a lot of the time. Feelings tell them when they're hungry, or when you're too hot, or how you feel about other people, or whether or not you actually like your job or not, or these sorts of things. One of the differences between facts and feelings is that feelings are how we encounter the present in certain ways. As Laurent Berlon in her book Cruel Optimism talks about that affect, feelings are how the present first makes itself apparent to us. It is a real-time way of accessing reality. So it's not that feeling is not something that actually provides us with anything which is useful or provides us with any kind of useful information or has no truth value. But it's something which over-attunes us potentially to the present, to how things are right now. And to be excessively nervous, to be excessively, to rely too much on feeling and on one's neural networks of one's body and one's brain, is to be too over-attuned to the present. And that's what when we talk about feeling nervous and the kinds of psychosomatic symptoms that generates, it's a state of being over-conscious of where one is at this precise moment and what might be about to happen. Now, the interesting thing to me when you think about feeling as contrast to fact is that actually all sorts of aspects of our world today can be understood better as networks of feeling than as networks of fact. And the first, and rather kind of, this is an example I talk about in the book, is the financial system. Now, the technologies of the financial system throughout their history, if you look back to this, is an image of an early ticker tape back in the early 20th century, have always been about trying to share information about the world as quickly as possible, to provide information that is as close to real time as possible. That rather like our nervous systems provide us with this kind of real-time feedback on how things are right now and how am I too hot or too cold or too hungry and so on, and rather like my Google map was telling me about what to do next, do I turn left or right, the financial system can be better understood as a kind of neurological or neural global network through which real-time information is shared than as anything which, of course, it produces facts that at the end of the day can be reported in the Financial Times and turned into news items. But when you look at these technologies on this slide, that's the ticker tape and then these Bloomberg screens that are now the sort of integral to the nervous system of the financial markets. The central design ambition of these technologies, their central trait is, of course, to be accurate, but it's to provide information that is as fresh and as real-time as possible, and also that is attuned to people's eyes, that part of the design of these sorts of screens that you see here, what counts as a good design for these sorts of tables and screens, is the ability to take in that information and to react to it in ways that is as quick as possible. And of course, some traders, you even hear of some of them taking neural supplements to try and ensure that they remain ahead of the game, to act as quickly as possible. And the money that is made in financial markets is much of the time not, I mean, of course, there's all sorts of value investors who are sort of focused on underlying activities, but there's also a lot of financial investment that is aiming to simply be ahead of other people, to know first, to know faster than others, not to have any greater truth value than those who are going to find out later, but to know before them. And this actually, if you look at the work of the probably most influential free market thinker of the 20th century, that's Friedrich Hayek, he describes the market as a telecom network. He says it's more than a metaphor to describe the market, the price system, as a telecom network for relaying information backwards and forwards between people. And this is really has become something that originates, I think, in our society, in our financial system. I mean, the digitization or the computerization of stock markets in the 1980s was unleashed this mentality across our economy and turned financial markets into things that always seem to be one step ahead of the game of politics and so on. But what's happened, particularly with the spread of social media and of smartphones over the last 15 years, is that we've shifted socially from a reliance primarily on forms of record to forms of dashboard, to types of feedback mechanism, which part of their function is to tell us what is going on right now, and also to try and tell us, to enable us to be amongst the first to know what something is. That if it was purely a matter of knowing the truth about the world, we might often be better off simply switching these things off and waiting to read reports in the newspaper the next day, depending on the newspaper. But part of the appeal of these devices, and partly what makes them addictive, is precisely that they hold out the promise of allowing us to know very quickly and to remain in touch with the world, which is constantly changing. They are devices which are oriented towards a world of flux. Now, what's dangerous about this, and this is the sort of, as I develop this in the book, is that if you trace back some of the history of this ambition to share knowledge as quickly as possible, rather than to share knowledge as reliably as possible, and of course you can share reliable knowledge quickly and you can share bad knowledge slowly and so on, but nevertheless, that when you look at the technologies over time that have been pioneered this ambition to create these kinds of telecom networks for the most rapid, most type of knowledge available, that the frontiers of this have been pushed by war, by military needs. And in the book, I talk about examples such as Napoleon's Chape, my pronunciation is bad, but the network of this telecom network that he built over France, that was of these sorts of devices you see on the right here, which they got moved, and then the next one along got moved, and there's a map of France in early 19th century France for the sharing of information as quickly as possible, so as to to coordinate Napoleon's military and imperialist ambitions. And equally, the sorts of screens that we now spend so much of our time sitting in front of right now, in fact, the origins, as many people have explored some of the military origins, the Cold War origins of today's internet, but this project of trying to represent the world through an interface, through an interface that will allow a changing world to be represented to the eye in such a way as to enable rapid response and to provide feedback on a world that is moving the entire time. Here you see the SAGE, semi-automated ground environment, which was created by the Pentagon in 1958. But this way of sitting in front of a screen and surveying constantly changing indicators and data and information, this is something whose original conditions and the original urgency of creating these sorts of technologies, including the internet, as many of you will know, originates in the paranoid mentality of the Cold War, that if one doesn't know things as quickly as possible, that if one is too late in knowing things, then that could involve a catastrophic outcome, so that you can trace a clear genealogy between me and my Google Maps telling me how to get home from my office as quickly as possible and reacting to constant movements of traffic, that the origins of those sorts of interface technologies and of real-time data creations, sharing, back to these sorts of technologies. And in a way, I think that the implication of my thesis is that by importing these knowledge-sharing technologies into our lives, initially via the financial community, subsequently via civil society in the form of social media and screens, that we've also allowed a kind of quasi-paranoid mentality to emerge, in which nothing is ever stable, things are constantly changing, we need to be constantly checking. Of course, it has an addictive quality to it, but these are technologies of nervousness, technologies of both a psychic nervous state, but arguably of a political nervous state, in which there are no longer, the shortcoming of facts is that they are out of date, that they might be stable, they might be shareable, they might be trustworthy, and they might be a basis for dialogue across cultural and political boundaries, but that they don't move fast enough and that they don't update one fast enough. So just before I stop, I want to just throw this out there, because I think this is important to all of us in universities, that the term data is not the same thing as facts. I mean, everybody's obsessed with data nowadays. Facts probably sound rather analog in comparison, but facts require methods, they require standards, they require different ways of recording things. And as I say, read Mary Poovy's book, The History of the Modern Fact, for thinking clearly about exactly what this is. Traditionally on paper, now that would seem rather analog and old hat. Data is something which literally means that which is given, that what your eyes show you the whole time is data, what your skin tells you about the heat is data. Data is something which just requires sensory technologies. Facts, of course, also require data to establish their truth value. But data is just a matter of sensing things, smart cards, swiping, where you move, the look on your face. All of these things are data to someone who has the technology or the way of keeping track of it. Facts exist as public records of some kind. If facts were kept purely as private property, it's not clear that we would call them facts in the technical sense of the term. So in that sense, I think facts have a civic function that arguably data doesn't have. And of course, this is central to the paranoia of the political paranoia of the last 5 years, 4 years in democracies, is the sense that Facebook knows all sorts of things that we are never going to find out. That they are treating data, of course, as capital. It's something that they is not just intellectual property. It's actually a capital asset that they are constantly investing in trying to accumulate. And there are all these companies like Uber out there that make no profit, but they are just building up more and more data as a form of capitalization. Facts are empirical. They are things which reflect on events that are necessarily in the past. This, I think, is part of the way in which liberal elites of journalists or of scholars or of experts of various kinds look like they are not as lively, not as attuned to how things feel and are right now. Sometimes economists can look like they're behind the curve in lots of ways. And I've outlined some of the ways in which the changing nature of our economic lives and experiences may be ahead of, or necessarily are ahead of the sorts of indicators that governments commission, publish, and react to. Data, in its literal sense, can include things which are happening right at this moment. You hear of this idea of nowcasting, of different ways of trying to represent the world as it is now rather than as things that have happened, which is exactly what something like these financial screens and dashboards are doing. There is a political ideal built into these different technologies of knowledge that, without wanting to romanticize facts, and I think it's important to remember that the production of things like the facts of statistics, the facts of government bureaucracies, have a long history that is entangled in forms of colonialism and in forms of domination, and the communities that have produced them back to that period in the 17th century have been exclusive in all sorts of ways, and then we shouldn't I'm not trying to kind of romanticize some sort of idyllic, inclusive public sphere, but we need to understand what we're losing as well, which is types of record keeping that can be appealed to as a basis for trust and credibility. Data, as the technologies of data sharing are geared towards response, whether that's how do I get home as quickly as possible, whether that's how do I anticipate an incoming nuclear warhead, whether that's how do I sell this stock before it loses its price plummets. The whole notion of data as we now understand it, and these technologies of these interfaces for the representation of data are geared towards speed of reaction rather than to a form of social credibility. Now, there are all sorts of implications of this, and I'm sure you've got all sorts of questions for me about, oh my, after what I've covered. But we do need, I think, fundamentally on a philosophical and political level to think as scholars, as researchers, and as citizens, to think about what is our knowledge good for? What do we want knowledge to do? Which again is not something that many scientists are probably say, well, I just want it to be accurate. But there is a social dimension here, which is this distinction between knowledge as something which is more like a banknote, that is something that can be shared and hold its value as it gets passed around, or knowledge which potentially becomes, as we now call it, weaponized. That is something that can be used in order to provoke reaction and to create forms of political disruption. And we know that this is happening. We know that this is being deliberately done by various, often opaque sources. But I think the political and sociological question, and I don't have the magic bullets here, is how does, to go back to if we are in the job of defending a kind of knowledge for peace, how does it prosper under conditions of rising inequality, which creates growing alienation from centres of what appear to be technocratic and often are rather unaccountable technocratic centres? This is a major problem with the European project of the unrepresentative, distant nature of Brussels and Frankfurt. This growing gulf between technocracy and democracy. This is a problem that in the United States, John Dewey spent a lot of time trying to deal with this question of how to, what kind of public status to give experts. This rising suspicion around knowledge elites, it's extremely difficult to combat because it turns culture it uses culture war in order to point out that often quite accurately that people who work in that lawyers and journalists and scientists, oh well, they go to the same kinds of colleges and they hang out in the same sorts of cities, and maybe this is actually they're acting in league with each other. But there's also another question which I think people have been grappling with, people like Philip Mirowski and others in his book Science Mart, which is about the problem of a growing privatization of knowledge, which is now, I think, really sort of exacerbated by the rise of the platform economy, where knowledge becomes seen as not as a source of competitive advantage. That is, that its value is because I've got it and you don't have it. And once knowledge takes on that status, then it's not clear how it continues to perform the same kind of civic function. So that's a kind of general overview of my thesis, and I'm sure there are lots of questions, but I'm going to stop there. David, I don't know if you're muted, but I can't hear you anything.
Professor Davies, thank you so much for such a provocative and interesting presentation and book. One of the disadvantages of the Zoom format is that we have difficulty applauding you, but you can consider yourself applauded, I think. So this begins the second part of today's meeting, the curated question and answer session, in which I'll be posing questions and comments to Professor Davies that came from this particular cohort, fall 2020 start cohort of our college scholars as part of the undergraduate honors program. So some of this will be in no particular order because, well, in no particular order, okay. First question and comment. Politicians and people in power have been lying for centuries. You say that in recent times, we as a society have become overtaken by emotions, but hasn't that occurred in the past also? Religious fervor, racist ideas, and just plain ignorance have prevented use of common knowledge and the development of science in the past. So this particular student wants to know what's so special about this moment.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I think it's important not to create an image of an era in which you know, there was. I mean, that's one of the problems with the concept of post-truth. Is, you know, there was never this kind of era in which this this sort of factual project had some sort of kind of supremacy. And I think it's worth also remembering that these scientific communities have spent a lot of their history battling to be taken seriously. You know, in the early days, they were seen as a sort of sect. In the 19th century, they often had to battle against kind of sort of like other types of science that they didn't want to be associated with, and then obviously today this is happening again. I think, I mean, what you know, as hopefully my talk conveys, what I'm interested in is that what we haven't had until recently is as an alternative infrastructure through which emotion and feeling and sentiment can become captured and coordinated in quite this way. Now, there have been, of course, there's been propaganda. The idea of propaganda was born in the 1930s as you know, in response to the way advertising seemed to be able to sway people's sentiments and so on. What I don't think, I mean, and so propaganda is not new, obviously. But I think that what I'm particularly interested in is this idea of a real-time feedback circuit in which the sheer speed of expression and of the sharing of experiences and of sentiments is this constant, and I think you can include 24 rolling news in all of this as well. Is that there is not the same kind of punctuation in our public sphere, or the moments of pause within which there might be a kind of an interruption in this constant flow of sentiment. So I think that I'm not suggesting there was a time of rationality and now we're living in a time of irrationality. And I'm not suggesting that the kind of the mass public, although I think we can see that something, you know, a loss of trust in politicians and in journalists, which really kind of took off through the 1980s, or according to that Gallup chart I put earlier in the US in the 1970s. That loss of trust, in particular in the institutions of the media and of democracy, is, I mean, it's not, you know, we're talking about the last 3 or 4 decades now. But I think that what has been layered on top of that is obviously this new social infrastructure of real-time information sharing and of suspicion. I mean, like, this is what a lot of what social media does, is that, I mean, I use Twitter. I know that if I cast doubt on the BBC or on a politician, I get, you know, 50 retweets or whatever. And if I say this seems like a good and interesting thing for them to say, I get barely any. I mean, this is how it works. This is the kind of, you know, the way in which these technologies interact with us. So there is a kind of something corrosive going on that is enabled by the technologies.
Let me try to be a little bit nimble here, and because another student asked a question about that, follow on to that, namely that you can get more likes and more attention by, and the media can get more eyeballs and so on by concentrating on negative things rather than positive ones. And so, yeah, here's the question. Violence and drama tend to be remembered more, so things like news and social media tend to focus on them because people find it more interesting. Do you think things would change for the better if informational networks were to focus on positive events more as well, and didn't only focus on what would bring attention?
I mean, broadly, I mean, I'm not sure the distinction is between positive and negative. I think it's a good question, and I think it starts from a very important observation and intuition about, obviously, that we know that rage and there is a whole now kind of media ecology. I mean, it's much worse in your country than in mine, although we have our own problems, in particular in relation to certain newspapers still that it's and moving online. But I think that the way in which rage and anger seems to kind of, an outrage, draws attention, and I mean, no doubt neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists can have their own explanations as to why this might be. But I mean, one of the studies that I cite in the book, someone did a sentiment analysis study of Twitter, showing that the quality of a tweet that predicts the highest level of sharing is what they call moral emotion. And moral emotion basically means a combination of denunciation and passion, a sort of passionate denunciation, if you like, which it's in some ways is a sort of, I mean, it could be I think it can be a passionate approval as well. I think it could be a sort of, like a sort of devotion, but there is a kind of there's a combination of declaring things good or bad, but doing so in a way that is that has a kind of an embodied sort of passion about it as well. Now, in a way, that is precisely the opposite of what the scientific project depends upon, which is the sort of distancing of embodied reaction to things from how they are described. That there has to be a sort of almost like a kind of dispassionate or a sort of critical distance involved in order for something to hold credibility in the eyes of peer reviewers and fact checkers and this sort of thing. So I think that's one of the difficulties. Of course, I think good news stories and here's some people getting on well with their like here's people overcoming their differences. I mean, it would be I think it would be good and healthy to have more stories of that nature. But I think that I think there's other things going on as well, which are really kind of very difficult challenges to confront, of how this issue of a sort of the power of moral emotion, and how that speaks to and encourages. I think one of the things that obviously has so much power in a type of populist politics and on social media is the claim we are being ignored. No one is caring. No one's listening to us. No one cares about us. That is something that has a kind of a resonance that it really translates into all of the institutions of mainstream society are bankrupt and broken in some way. And of course, this is Trumpian rhetoric through and through. Is all of those institutions are letting you down, but I'm not, kind of thing. And it's a sort of it's a type of rhetoric that is very powerful on social media and difficult to counteract.
Thank you for that. The next chapter here is a kind of constellation of several questions about the same theme, and I can set it up, I think, by making the following observation. If I ask myself the question, if I were a peasant in the year 1350 or even a merchant in the year 1350, how do I know something? The main answer was, my understanding of history in the last 1,000 years is the main answer was you went and asked the Catholic Church what it thought the right answer was. And or maybe you asked the king what the right answer was. And in both cases, there was a great incentive of the power sources to tell you what the right answer was in a way that would minimize your chance of taking up a pitchfork and burning down the nearby mansion, for example. So one of the students wants to know, in the Knowledge for Peace chapter of your book, there was a reference to basic human instinct and the creation of government, and your quote is, "The state exists because people fear violence and seek to avoid it." Would you consider this motive for creating a government as selfish to the ideals of the people creating it, or selfless to the notion that reducing violence will protect more lives, or both, or what?
I mean, I think that this is a reference to the thought of Thomas Hobbes, who was mentioned earlier, this. I mean, in some ways, is an attempt to grasp the sort of foundational problem of liberalism in the philosophical sense, not necessarily in the sense of government spending or something like that. That in order to understand questions of justice and questions of authority, you need to start by understanding problems of human nature. So for Hobbes, anyway, the problem was that humans might be very good and altruistic people, and yet they might still rationally end up killing each other because of problems of effectively what economists call collective action problems, which is that, you know, I might be a good person, but if I don't know that you're a good person as well, and how do I know to believe you? I think it's better if I kill you first, because otherwise it'll be too late, kind of thing. That's the problem that Hobbes was concerned with. Is it selfish? I mean, it's selfish in the sense that we all have a. I mean, I think that I think we all have a self-preservation instinct, and in that sense, peace, from a liberal perspective, is one that is a value that trumps, I mean, effectively all other values. Now, whether that, you know, is something that is carried out in the conduct of modern states over the last 350 years is a whole other question. But as an argument, it's an argument for taking people's human needs, sort of biological needs, seriously as a basis for the construction of a civil society. So, I mean, I don't think whether it's, I don't think it's either selfish or unselfish. It's that unselfish, good people are not enough to create a good society. That's, I suppose, the problem.
Thank you for that. And the logical conclusion of that line is the next question. When comparing previous patterns of revolutions to today's political climate in the United States, which has been building up for years, do you think America is headed for some kind of revolution, or will the country be able to restore some sort of order? And what would you say would be a tipping point toward either outcome?
Oh gosh, I mean, this is really hard for me to, you know, I'm wary of commenting on other people's sort of day-to-day lived realities. That, I mean, it's obviously, I can tell it's a worrying time, and there's a fear of institutions not being up to the job of holding the society together and this sort of thing. So I'm wary of saying too much about. I mean, I don't want to say anything that would make people seem alarmed. I mean, it's not, revolution isn't the immediate problem. It's, I mean, civil war is the sort of, is the
yes,
violence that is more to be feared in this sort of situation, where you have people's fundamental beliefs about reality diverging at the same time as there is all sorts of fear of the other side. No, I'm not. No, I don't. I mean, I don't. You know, I don't want to. I don't think America is absolutely on the cusp of a civil war. I think that it's extremely difficult to see how, when you've got, you know, a third of one party's voters believing in some fantastical conspiracy theories, I think it's very hard to sort of see kind of on what basis sort of a type of sort of, where does consensus lie once some of these sorts of things take off? Where is the grounds of a possible consensus? It's not just the things like conspiracy theories. Obviously, there are political forces that don't want consensus, and they don't want compromise, and they don't want a sort of mutually agreed outcome, and that's an extremely difficult thing to resolve. But I don't think it's hopeless. I don't. So I think it's. I think that it's urgent at the moment. But I mean, the tipping point, I think, is in, you know, I mean, there is a fear of what happens if one side simply refuses to accept an electoral outcome, and what if there aren't enough sort of norms and precedents in place with which to deal that is a tipping point of sort. Whether it's one which then points towards violence is a whole other question. But I'm not a historian of civil war, so I that's as much as I'll say.
Well, you can get, I don't know if this got much coverage in Britain, but you can get an idea of where things are at the moment when you hear that an armed militia not too long ago, about 10 days ago, came close to instantiating a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of what the dangers are. I just don't want to be sort of fanning flame. I don't want to be exacerbating a nervous state from sort of 10,000 miles away.
Sure. And I can add something for everyone as a way of looking forward as well. On Saturday, December 5th, we will have the pleasure and honor of hearing from Professor William Davies again, this time in conversation with the journalist Ezra Klein, the gentleman who founded the Vox network and so on. And they will be in conversation about the election and other matters to do with politics and economy and so on. As you say, a number of us are afraid that as of December 5th, with the election having been on November 3rd, that we won't know who is president yet. And so it will be quite timely for the two of you to be speaking with each other. So that's a bit of promotion for everyone to, that particular event will be sponsored by the Humanities Institute, and they have webinar facilities that allow up to 3,000 people. And so that's going to be a rather larger event, which we hope all of you who are listening to this can participate in. Different topic. When referring to the survival of the truest, you mentioned the following, quote, "A pure free market ideology installs social Darwinism as the organizing principle of society, resulting inevitably in spiraling inequality." And this student would like to know, what exact types of inequality are you referring to here? Or is it a combination of social, economic, class inequality? What do you have in mind?
Well, I think, I mean primarily economic inequality, in the sense that, I think that and this is comes out of a discussion of the thinking of Hayek and other of the neoliberal economists of the mid 20th century, that the market takes on the market acquires a scientific function for these free marketeers, in the sense that it discovers the best ideas, it discovers the best employees, that through force of competition, it becomes possible to identify who is the worthy and who is the less worthy, and that competition is a constant kind of sorting mechanism. And in that sense, the role of the market for some of the, particularly on the kind of more libertarian end of this argument, so the economists who would be exhibit some of that would be Ludwig von Mises, who is a kind of hero to many libertarians, and many, I think, American conservatives would have celebrated Mises' ideas, but that the role of the market ceases to just be a way of sort of maximizing welfare, which is how sort of orthodox economics conceives of it back to Adam Smith, and becomes instead a way of sort of identifying greatness, really, of identifying that which deserves public approval, that which is it's a bit like the role of, do you trust the opinion poll based on scientific method, or do you trust the betting markets? So the betting markets are a way of basically sifting millions of different views of the future, and the expectation is that the truth will kind of emerge through this kind of competition between all of these different views, where everyone is risking their own money in the hope of being right, and the people taking risks with their money is a much better way of establishing truth than using a methodology of a representative sample survey. So in terms of what does this mean, I'm not saying that we've witnessed the implementation of that kind of radical libertarianism. I think that the ideology is at large in some societies today, and there are people who might want to push it further. But I think that there is, I suppose, at its worst, it becomes a kind of a this is the point about Darwinism, is that it takes on a kind of, it starts to mesh with an idea of human aptitude that is fundamentally kind of biological, which is that certain people, are born with the kind of genes to kind of make them winners, and that others aren't, and that it is somehow just that it becomes the basis on which society is organized. And, this is where, Jeff Bezos is the richest man in the world. Well, he saw the future, he took the risks, he did what he did, and frankly, like there's a kind of a sort of winner take all kind of Darwinistic attitude that says, well, actually, maybe trillionaires are okay. So there's a sort of that is that there's a kind of the level of inequality that this authorizes ideologically is way higher than one which says, well, we need to have, gradations of status and we need pay differentials, otherwise people aren't going to kind of, bother trying to work their way up or have a career or have any kind of aspiration to achieve anything. So it's not about inequality per se. It's about the potential for inequality to actually drive people to have completely different types of life experiences, and to almost live in different kinds of, to be in different sort of worlds almost.
So I am an applied mathematician by training, and when I look at the work that economists have done in trying to prove theorems of the form, if blah blah policies are put in place, then the result will be great because it will maximize expected GDP growth or something like that, for instance. The problem there from a mathematical perspective is that it should be a constraint optimization, not an unconstrained one. We know that anytime policies are put in place, there will be winners and losers. Well, what if the losers are the Earth's environment, for example? And so maximizing GDP going forward would be everybody who knows something about the scientific reality of climate change would agree is a stupid algorithm, and instead should be replaced by something like maximize GDP growth subject to paying attention to inequalities across subgroups and trying to make sure that the climate is preserved for future generations and ... Would you have comments as a sociologist on the misuse of mathematics in economics and other social sciences in this way?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, obviously there are attempts to solve the problem with different indicators. So there's, people have been pushing for headline indicators that capture the ecological degradation better. I mean, Nicolas Sarkozy had a whole kind of, got people like Amartya Sen and others to try and come up with these different indicators. There's also the whole natural capital accounting agenda, which tries to deal with this. I think that that there is a sort of a, one of the problems is that when you try to integrate nature and the very possibility of human life as we currently know it into a kind of a financial framework, you might be sort of that can be a sort of that can lead to a sense of apathy, or a sense of that sort of business as usual can continue, as long as we sort of tweak our investments and we kind of factor in different kinds of externalities and this sort of thing. So I think that, generally speaking, I think that the power of economics since World War II has been sort of expanding and expanding politically, and while it's been getting more mathematical. But I think that this has certainly done very little. I think many of our crises of recent years have demonstrated the extent to which an extremely narrow economic mentality and worldview has sort of rather led, has constrained politicians, while also meant that some of these kind of more substantive, potentially quite dramatic crises that are emerging at the moment. So you take an example like, take the pandemic at the moment in terms of mathematics. I mean, all of the Britain's advisory body to the government is basically epidemiologists, well, that makes sense, behavioral psychologists, because they're just sort of trying to think about how can you make people stay indoors better. And yet there is no comparative policy analysis. There doesn't seem to be any institutionalized effort to understand why has Germany done so well, and actually Italy's been doing very well since its initial, since the catastrophe of February and March. But there doesn't seem to be any organized attempt to actually understand the institutions and the policies that work versus the ones that don't work. There seems to be endless modeling and endless attention to sort of, like there's this obsession with things like randomized controlled trials that we see in the policy elites of both. I think, the United States has this as well, and in Britain. I'm sure these things have all sorts of useful functions, but when serious crises hit, I think it can, there are other types of knowledge that are available.
A quick comment on that from my statistician perspective. The problem with trying to draw valid cause and effect conclusions from non-experimental data, observational data, like what's been happening, each country just tries stuff and then we see outcomes, is that there are typically too many competing possible causes for it to be a straightforward matter to tease out which is the dominant one. And so I take your point that there's been a lot of modeling and it doesn't look like it's led much of anywhere, but the crucial problem is that in the non-experimental setting, the assumptions you make about things that you may not know whether the assumptions are right or not turn out to be very strongly influential in the answer that you get. So what you're asking for is important and hard, but I'm here to say that it's really hard as well.
I'm sure it is.
Two questions combined from the students. First question, as you were writing your book, did you feel that some statements you made did not apply to all Western nations? Can you give examples of countries in which facts and emotions currently do exist comfortably side by side? And if so, what's the difference about them that results in this good outcome? And the second student asked something similar. Has this rise of populism occurred in countries beyond the US and the UK? And if so, which countries have been leading and which following this movement?
I mean, the first question is a good one. I don't have a clear answer to that. I don't. Yeah, it's an important point. I mean, it's that not to get too swept up in sort of kind of overextending any kind of examples and lessons. Yeah, it's a good question. I've never been asked that before, and it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, of course, every national trajectory and every set of institutions is different. But I think I suppose I'm trying to deal in. I mean, I'm trying to deal in some sort of trends that I think we can see to a greater or lesser extent in lots of different situations. But I don't want to claim that the sort of experiences of the United Kingdom are somehow sort of kind of typical. It's just that I think that there are these trends that we can observe in particular instances. As for the second question, I mean I'm not a populism scholar. I mean, I know that people look particularly to people like Jan Werner Müller and Cass Mudder and others sort of write about places like Hungary and the example of the kind of illiberal democracy that has developed there. I mean, the nation that has been probably that exhibits the most acute instance of some of this epistemological crisis that many people have looked at is Russia. I mean, that's the sort of, and is seen as being the kind of the leader of a sort of partly of a sort of troll warfare and these kind of meme factories and the kind of if you'll excuse my language, what Steve Bannon called flooding the zone with shit, which is this idea that you basically just throw out so much stuff into the news media and so on that people basically give up trying to work out what's actually happening and what's not, which is something that, I mean, in the UK, there's a scholar called Peter Pomerantsev who's written, it's called, what's it called? Everything is something. Anyway, Peter Pomerantsev is the guy. Anyway, but that's, you know, that's often seen as being the kind of on the vanguard of a certain kind of information warfare. And I mean, this is you know, it's well documented as to how this has been used as a type of as a weapon, and this goes back before the, you know, long before the 2016 election, in terms of how Russia used these techniques internationally. India is
Thank you for that.
worth talking about here as well. I mean, like the Modi administration is and the use of social media to advance nationalist agendas is something that, and particularly WhatsApp is a big, you know, WhatsApp is the platform that in India and Brazil is how nationalist populist political agendas seems to be advanced to a great extent in ways that is quite curious to those of us who see WhatsApp in a rather different kind of light, but it's well advanced in those places.
I myself have made a bit of a study of the country of Norway, and it is pretty clear that over the last 40 years or so, the Norwegians have been really good at the government trying to actively wonder what are the needs and wants of its people, and doing things from a government point of view, especially with investing the North Sea oil revenues. But then came the Syrian refugee crisis, and Norway was asked to take a bunch of Syrian refugees in, and this created a very sharp rift in their culture, because the issue I'm bringing up is one of homogeneity of society versus heterogeneity, and the fact that the more heterogeneous a society is, the more difficult it is for everybody to get along, right? So before the Syrians started showing up, Norway was 99.9% Caucasian, and all of a sudden they have a surprisingly strong nationalist movement from people who are trying to keep immigrants out. So do you think that there is a gradient or a fault line on heterogeneity and homogeneity that determines the way a collection of people behave together?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is clearly it's an empirical question to a great extent. And I know that, I mean, Robert Putnam in the United States has done some studies of this sort of thing. I think in the UK, I mean, one of the curious things is that actually the most diverse, ethnically diverse parts of the UK anyway, which is have been extremely sort of broadly very successful, actually. I mean, I think that a lot of the more kind of sort of a lot of nationalist sentiments have developed in parts of the country that are actually, they may feel threatened by something, but actually it's not, you know, it's some distance from where they live. So I think that it's at least possible for highly homogenous communities, maybe, you know, to develop sentiments that they are somehow kind of under threat in some way. I mean, highly diverse communities, I suppose you could say, are already kind of much of the time quite comfortable with with heterogeneity. So I suppose maybe it's, I mean, one of the things which people have talked about, and this is your Norway example is perhaps speaks to, is that it's the pace, to go back a bit to my question, the issue of should we be looking at changes, not aggregates, it's the pace of change that potentially is more important than the aggregate level of heterogeneity. But then, you know, there's the story in Germany, which took in a huge number of refugees, whatever it was, 2015, 2016. You know, it's an extremely there's an extremely kind of positive story there about how the integration has worked and the employment, how the labour market has absorbed them and so on. So I mean, it's, you know, but I mean, Germany at the moment looks, particularly in the context of the pandemic, looks like a sort of, it seems to kind of, its governance model seems to sort of be superior to nearly everywhere else in Europe at the moment, particularly in relation to the pandemic.
Okay, thank you for that. This draws to a close the curated set of questions and answers. And now I'll move to the final section of today's meeting, general questions and answers from participants. I have some such items to share with you. Here's the first one. Can you speak to the role that the end of the Cold War has played in the fragmentation of the perception of truth and of worldviews?
That's a very
end of the Cold War.
End of the Cold War. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, I think, yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I suppose that issue of collectivities being forged and mobilized around some enemy. I mean, this is a sort of, I mean, I think like this is kind of COD psychology, really. But I think, you know, clearly that sense of shared others and shared enemies and so on has the ability to avoid this sort of fragmentation of identities that we've witnessed. I think I'm trying to think. I mean, how exactly that would sort of play into my thesis. I mean, I think that, I mean, because of course the Cold War also was a time of great sort of deceit and deception in lots of ways. So it's not that the Cold War was a sort of represented a kind of a high point for a sort of for objectivity in public life, although it did of course lead to, in the United States anyway, to huge federal investment in science of a sort that led to the rapid expansion of certain aspects of a kind of scientific institutions. But I think, yeah, I mean, yeah, I had never really thought about that, to be quite honest. I mean, I think it's probably one of the most important kind of turning points. And I think that clearly new types of enemy have become crucial to identities of Western democracies. I guess, you know, particularly in the 21st century, of Islam and the sort of way in which the right has mobilized against, particularly against after 9/11, but also some of the kind of, I mean, nationalism in Europe is largely an Islamophobic phenomenon as much as anything else. And that's you know, become the basis on which appeals to nationhood and ethnicity have been made on the far right. And it's possible, I suppose that, you know, the big other in the past was on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So I suppose there's something that has gone on there. So it's an interesting question.
Let's dig a little deeper in that. Yes. So if you think about making judgments about similarity between things, the mathematical version, the first thing you could say is this thing here is different from that thing over there. And from the moment we were a species, and even before, that was a very useful judgment to be able to make. This tree is different from that saber-toothed tiger. However, there have been many, many times in human history where people have gone beyond the judgment of one thing is unequal to, the inequality sign. And they felt compelled, now that they've noticed that one thing is different from another, to go on to the judgment that therefore one thing must be better than the other one, and I have to figure out which one is better and maybe even attack the one that's weaker and so on. So, and of course the Crusades during the Middle Ages are a really horrible example of this. I noticed that my Catholic religion is different from that of those Muslim people over there, and therefore I go from the judgment of inequality, I go farther incorrectly to say, therefore my religion must be better than theirs, and I have to either convert them or kill them. So this concept of us versus them instead of us and them is something that I find absolutely at the heart of human behavior over a really long period of time. Do you see any way that societal organization can encourage not going beyond us and them to a state of us versus them? Well,
I think so. There's a very powerful answer to that question from the last, which dates back to the Enlightenment, which is that the market is the way in which you can do that. And that's, I mean, you know, Adam Smith, who is really the founder of liberal economics, it's often forgotten that he was, one of the reasons he thought markets were good was that they enabled what he called sympathy, which was that it enabled people to see things from someone else's point of view. And I think, and it's also, I think, significant, going back to my talk, that these communities of expertise and of fact keeping and so on of sort of early modern Europe were heavily clustered around the world of merchants and of early finance, early modern capitalist finance. So in that sense, that the market becomes the space which alleviates that problem. And that's why I suppose, you know, for a while, the golden era of globalization, of the kind of between the Cold War and I don't know whether you say 9/11 or 2008, but certainly there was maybe a sort of a decade, which is when, you know, Francis Fukuyama was talking about the end of history and so on, that it looked as if the market had created a single human project in a way. That so that's the sort of the liberal fallback answer. Now that we do have the instruments available, which is exchange and money. So I mean that's the institutional sort of possibility. Now, of course, markets fail in all sorts of drastic and sometimes very disastrous ways, and that's been in some ways the crisis of liberalism, particularly in Europe, is one that is a sort of gradual inability to deal with the consequences of 2008. But I mean, I think that there are, you know, you can think of other ways in which sympathy, to use Smith's idea, can be inculcated in people. There are styles of communication. There are ways of storytelling. There are, you know, for instance, you talk about refugees. I mean, it's people kind of have one image of refugees that is presented to them by the media that is likely to make them afraid and angry. But you can come up with a different image of a refugee that is likely to make them sympathetic and compassionate. And I think that, you know, we have choices about how to do this. I mean, it's like it's not a sort of foregone conclusion that fear and anger is sort of, and I go back to one of the first questions I was asked. I mean, we have partly a sort of perhaps a sort of heavily commercialized media industry that thinks it can make more money out of fear and anger than it can out of sympathy and compassion. So I think that, you know, there are things are not, we shouldn't be fatalistic about this. But at the same time, of course, you're right that, I mean, you know, collectivities are much easier to build in opposition to other collectivities than without them.
Thank you for that. A completely different direction. Do you have any thoughts about the politicization of epistemology? Popular activist scholarship makes the metaphysical claim that epistemologies are inherently subjective and there are no universal truths free from flawed subjectivity grounded in prejudice. And this person wishes to ask, how can we depoliticize knowledge, reason, and science? And where do you see the role of censorship in this? I mean,
I think I have a sense of what this is aiming towards. I mean, in a way, my talk was politicizing epistemology because I talked about knowledge for peace and knowledge for war. I mean, that's kind of politicizing epistemology. And I have to confess that I'm interested in the history of science and in some critical philosophies of science. So I'm not immune to that. I think that what the question is pointing towards is a particular niche example of how to politicize epistemology, which, yes, says that that it is impossible for people to step outside of their of an identity that is forged via their gender and their ethnicity and their other aspects of their identity, and that it is hopeless to aim for any form of sort of attempt to kind of transcend those things. I mean, I think that the point is that it's not politicizing epistemology that's the problem. It's a failure to think through what good scientific institutions need to look like, and what kind of procedures and so on that need to be involved. There's no intrinsic problem with trying to drive new political practices into universities, or new procedures for broadening the kinds of voices that get heard in universities, as long as there are also procedures through which to then resolve differences in a way that has some kind of political legitimacy. So it's not the fact that I shouldn't be afraid of considering that knowledge production has politics involved in it, but we shouldn't then duck some of the kind of difficult work that is involved in trying to kind of reach conclusions in spite of that. And I think that's possibly what sometimes happens, is that the sort of destructive aspect of politicization goes on, but then the sort of the constructive and the sort of the resolution to difference, that work is we don't really have the tools. We're not as skilled and as sometimes maybe not as interested in that other bit of work.
In our own country, in academia, the process of applying for grants and getting them, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone in an engineering school, where a great deal of the money that comes into engineering schools around this country is money from the American military. And so we can ask the question one layer back: why is there so much money floating around for military research? And the answer may well be that politicians tend to think that tossing more money at the military is a popular thing to do, no matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And the result is that research gets done that advances the military agenda over top of other things. The National Science Foundation pure research budget for mathematics and statistics and so on is about 4% of the budget, combined budget of all the defense research agencies and so forth. Any comments?
Well, I mean, it's yeah, I think it's also a way in which maybe spending money under the umbrella of the military is a way that the US state has managed to sustain. I mean, notions of the common interest or the public interest can seem rather social democratic and European unless you tie them up with the military, in which case they seem very sort of sort of tough and praiseworthy. And so there is a sort of, perhaps there's a sense in which this is a sort of a guise for public spending that doesn't kind of come under attack and look too much like socialism or something. I mean, I think that clearly there is. I mean, military, military spending by the United States government since 1945, or since 1940, really, it has transformed the way we all live our lives. It gave us the technologies through which I'm currently speaking to you right now, and so on. So it's been one of the most transformative and sort of innovative forces in world history over the last 80 years or so. But clearly it also, I mean, the sort of destructive potential of that kind of goes without saying. But I think that there is, I mean, I imagine that there are other sort of sociological dimensions to it. I mean, in terms of, and exactly how that leads to the sort of ill-directed investment. I mean, I couldn't say, but I mean, it's, clearly it's, and then the distinction between pure and applied science and how that then carries on, gets sustained under these conditions is something which sort of science policy scholars, I'm sure, have lots to say about.
So there is a can of worms here about the concepts of subjectivity and objectivity. In the index to your book, objectivity gets 13 lines, whereas subjectivity doesn't even have an index entry. Is it your view that subjectivity is just what's left over after a failed attempt to achieve objectivity?
Yeah, I don't know, subjectivity. I mean, subjectivity is, yeah, I mean, I think probably when I'm talking about objectivity in the book, it's less as a sort of it's less a mark of praise or a sort of a descriptor of certain types of truth, and more about the effort to try and achieve sort of objectivity. How do we organize laboratories, or whatever it might be, in order to sort of view the world objectively, or how do we, if a journalist wants to achieve objectivity, it's not that they've got to somehow sort of switch or do something to their own minds. It's just they've got to interview the right kinds of people, and to try and construct their story in the right kind of way. So it's a learned practice, it's a set of practices more than anything else. What is meant by subjectivity, I think, is, people use the term, I'm being subjective now. That kind of means I'm letting my personal opinion cloud things, or I'm letting my own personal feelings cloud things, or something like that. Subjectivity, it's interesting. So one of the things which I kind of think is worth reflecting on when you think about the history of science in terms of that I was doing earlier, the term expert and the term experiment both relate back to the concept of experience, and what it means to do an experiment, and what it means to be an expert, is to be disciplined in the way in which you marshal and organize experiences, so that rather than sort of if you want to confirm that water boils at 100 degrees, you don't simply kind of sort of heat up some water and sort of go, oh look, it's probably about 100 degrees now. You use a thermometer and you organize your behavior, you organize the zone of experience in ways that is, as we call, disciplined in sciences, and that you have certain rigor, and you have certain procedures, and you have other witnesses, and you organize this whole event of the water heating up in ways that is considered to be objective. But it's still ultimately experience that you're dealing in. It's still something that is provided to sense data of one kind or another, in the sense that you witness things via your own subjectivity. So and we could go into kind of philosophical tangles here, but I think that I'm not that interested in sort of what sort of what subjectivity sort of means in all of this context. I think the question is how historically and politically have we sought to achieve sort of ways of representing the world that people can agree on in spite of their differences. So, and that's where the sort of, my example of the A to Z is actually a sort of a way of being objective about the nature of geography, in my sort of rather sort of petty example earlier.
Although even there, the choice of which buildings to name on the page, the A to Z page, and so on, that there was an element of subjectivity there as well.
Which is true of anything. Economists want to be objective about economic activities, but they think that price is something that deserves to be focused on, and not other aspects of behavior. So, all disciplines make some kind of decision about what counts as indicative and significant information.
In mathematics, pure mathematics is completely deductive. It's based on statements of the form, if I make assumptions A, then consequences B result. Sure. And this sort of thing can, I think, be said to have truly earned the name objective. You can't have alternative facts about right triangles without risking the bridge you're building falling down.
Right.
Looks like you were about to make a comment.
No. I whether that's. It's certainly. In the history of philosophy, that would be considered to be an example of rationalism, in the sense that it's the making of statements that exist, that are true independently of anything that you encounter. That these things are true regardless of what happens, or what you encounter, or what data turns up. It remains true. So it's almost a sort of, to me, but maybe these are sort of nuances of language, but to me those claims are, I can see that they're objective in the sense that they don't depend on subjectivity, but they also aren't a property of objects, in the sense that, like my shirt is an object. It's not a property of objects that those claims are true. It's a property of mathematical logic. So there's a certain sort of But anyway, we might be kind of we might be using these.
Perhaps this is wandering too far into byways of epistemology. So let me draw this to a close by bringing one last set of questions to you. Let me take a second to make sure I've got this right. Toward the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the phrase roadmap out of this mess. And one of the participants has asked the question, if you describe the present as the decline of reason and the rise of feeling, when and where does this decline and rise stop? In what way would you predict and describe the future state of reason and feeling? And I offer you the opportunity to talk for a few minutes about any thoughts you have about the roadmap out of this mess.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, clearly society's historic response to this has been education. I think that what we're all doing should be part of the attempt to push back. I think we also we owe it to ourselves and to those we teach and those who use our research and this sort of thing to not get to understand some of the risks of some of the technologies that we're all now immersed in, of these kinds of real-time data flows that we inhabit. Some of the answers that I would give as a European might seem less plausible, I think, particularly given some of the political situation in the United States. But I think that there's been a long ambition to regulate the media better in Britain, so as to not simply to try and make kind of you can't sort of regulate people into telling the truth. You can't sort of criminalize lying or anything like that. There are places where it's easier to regulate that sort of thing than others. But I think that the way in which the production of news content and claims about the nature of reality have become entangled with commerce, with the search for profit. This is the one of the major problems that we face, and we've already talked about this, of sort of how the way in which rage and unhappiness draws more eyeballs. There's this terrific article in the New Yorker by Jane Mayer from, I think it was early 2019, called The Fox News White House, which is about effectively that Rupert Murdoch really doesn't like Donald Trump one little bit. It's just that Donald Trump being in the White House means more people watch Fox. And this is kind of what all Rupert Murdoch cares about. And so there's a certain sort of symbiosis, or a certain sort of, a kind of mutually beneficial arrangement where a certain style of politics involves selling a certain more advertising revenue. And this is also the business model of Facebook and as well. So I think that this is the current problem we face now. The ability it's very difficult to imagine how you start to regulate the production of news content and information differently, because who's really which US government is going to want to break up Facebook or break up Google at a time when they see themselves as being in some sort of geopolitical conflict with China. That why would you sort of take apart some of the sorts of platforms that actually that might be seen as being a sort of competitive advantage in some way. But I think ultimately we need to at least recognize what the problem is, which is that effectively there are political and commercial forces out there which make a lot of money from provoking reactions in us. And I think that, the answers to that do perhaps involve forms of antitrust, forms of regulation, which I think could produce the outcome of which could be a less nervous public in some ways. That ultimately this nervous state that I'm interested in and talking about is one in which we are made to feel less safe than we probably are, in which we are more alert than we need to be, in which we feel like, oh, I haven't actually checked the feed on my phone for 15 minutes. I bet something new. I mean, that ultimately is a sort of behavioral challenge for all of us, is to self-regulate better. But I think that that's the, you know, and I think the final thing I want to say actually is something which I try to hope the book does a bit of, is not to create a kind of an opposition between sort of reason good, emotion bad, although kind of course, that's partly the tenor of what I've said and what we've been talking about, but which is to think more strategically about speed. That is that that there is a virtue in forms of content and forms of information about the world, which might take longer to assemble, but which or to check and to validate, but which actually is of greater kind of political utility. I mean, there are movements, I don't know where you have it in the States, but called things like slow news, which is a bit like slow food. So in that sense, it might be a sort of, you know, like a privileged thing that people consume when they're worrying about their nutrition, you know, sort of thing. But I think that, you know, we need to identify what these problems are.
Very last question then. What books would you recommend for people who enjoyed your Nervous States book?
What books? What do I recommend? I tell you, there's a great book, although it's pretty depressing actually. There's a brilliant book called The Twittering Machine, which is by Richard Seymour. This is a British scholar, but The Twittering Machine, which is if ever you think you're using too much social media or you can't put your phone down, it's a good book for kind of making you sort of think more about that. The Peter Pomerantsev books, you know, his I think it's called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. I think that's the name of the book, something like Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. But that and yeah, these are sort of some of the there's a great book which I reviewed in the London Review of Books, which is in some ways a much more bullish defense of reason than my book, I suppose, by Justin E.H. Smith, who's I think he's Canadian philosopher, which is called Irrationality, A History of the Dark Side of Reason. And it's a history of all sorts of different moments in sort of several centuries of philosophy and history of you know, it talks about dreams and it talks about the avant-garde and it talks about all of the different ways in which reason has been threatened by these different kind of others. And he's a expert on Spinoza, and he's basically someone he was inspired to write it actually by the election of Donald Trump. He just decided, like, you know, something is now happening where we have to almost sort of take sides, and we need to now just be on the side of reason. I mean, it's much more nuanced than that, because it's not simply a sort of denounce the liars sort of book, but he's an expert, and he's a philosopher, and it's a history of ideas, but it's called Irrationality, A History of the Dark Side of Reason.
Well, I'm sure that all participants join me in thanking you very much, Professor Davies, for this extremely thought-provoking 2 hours. Let me conclude by reminding people that several, I don't know how many weeks, but on Saturday, December 5th, starting about 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, California time, we will again have Professor Davies, this time in conversation with Ezra Klein, about aspects of politics and economics that have arisen as a result of the American election. And this will be publicized widely in UC Santa Cruz through the Humanities Institute. And everyone on this particular call is heartily invited, and everyone else that you know who might be interested in those topics. So once again, Professor Davies, thank you so very much. And I will draw this meeting to a close now. So goodbye, everyone. Bye for now. A video of this has been made and will be posted in some manner connected with the College Scholars Program. And Professor Davies has said that he was happy to have his slides posted as well. So there will be a web page that commemorates this event, including the slides and the video. Thanks again. Bye for now. Bye for now.